Hey everyone, here Peter Zeihan coming to you from Colorado with part 4 of our Ukraine implications series. Today we're going to be talking about what this means for American operational strategy as opposed to kind of our grand geopolitics. What we're seeing in Ukraine is a potential model for how the United States will fight wars for the next decade or two. One of the many consequences of the 20 years of the global war on terror is that the Americans, for the moment, are pretty much done. We're not going to be deploying troops in number anywhere in the world as a tripwire or as a major force designed to overthrow a government and remake it into whatever image we see fit. It's bloody. The first part, knocking off the government, that's the easy part, but then dealing what happens with the next day, the next month, the next year, the next decade, that sucks. And as we have discovered, with over 100,000 troops and trillions of dollars of investment in Afghanistan and Iraq, we are left with a broken nation and a nation that is, I don't want to call pathologically hostile, but not very fond about the United States about anything. It didn't work. And so the United States needs a different method. And in that method, the Army is no longer an option in terms of ground deployment. We will use the Army if we are faced with a strategic threat. But regardless of what you say about how we did Iraq and Afghanistan, I don't think any of us really thought of the two countries themselves as strategic threats. There may have been elements within them like Al-Qaeda that required getting knocked off. But to say that that required 100,000 troops, no. The 100,000 troops went to try to reshape the local space so that a future strategic threat would not arise. And in that, the war on terror was a failure. So, Ukraine. Here we have a highly motivated country of about 40 million people who is standing up to a nearly as motivated country of roughly 135 to 145 million, Russian numbers, who knows. And all they require is every bullet and drop of fuel that they need to prosecute a war. So what we're seeing is the United States has identified a strategic threat, Russia, and is using a local power to fight the war with American technical and industrial infrastructure. So we provide the equipment, and it's more than that. The technical side of things. The United States has the most sophisticated satellite monitoring system in the world. I'd argue it's better than everyone else's combined by a significant margin, probably a factor of 4 or 5. And we are providing time-on-target information for the Ukrainians to launch artillery and rocket strikes on targets that are miles, tens of miles away, and those rockets and artillery shells are hitting within a few feet of where they're aimed at. You can't do that with just the normal equipment. Even if we didn't have kill switches in all of our gear, and for the most part we do, without actively tapping the American satellite and information network, even if the Ukrainians could fire these things on their own, they wouldn't be able to hit the targets that they're hitting. They wouldn't be able to identify them. That requires a degree of American involvement, but not a degree of American involvement in Ukraine. So there's a whole kill chain here. Once you identify the target, you have to get that information to a weapon system that is in range, along with the coordinates and the guidance information, so that weapon systems can actually hit the target. In the past, that kill chain has been measured in hours. One of the many things that we've seen as a result of improved information technology in just the last 3 or 4 years is reducing that kill chain to just a few minutes. And this when American operators are not the ones who are using the equipment within the end country. This is the model for the future. Taking weapon systems that for the most part the United States considers relatively low tech and relatively outdated, transferring them to a third country that is fighting a war that we find to be in our strategic interests. Now, I'm sure people are going to hear that statement like, oh, of course, the Americans baited the Russians. No, I'm sorry. The Russians required no baiting to launch an imperialistic, fascist, genocidal war. They did that all on their own. This, I would underline, is one of the reasons, one of the many reasons why the United States and the Russians have not seen eye to eye since World War II. Because their method of fighting a war is just something we find morally repugnant and at least strategically distasteful. Anyway, back to the more important topic. This sort of conflict is something that can be leveraged at scale. At any given moment, there are dozens of operatives within the Ukrainian system that are interfacing with the American equivalent back in the United States or in NATO countries, providing this real-time information and providing roughly 80 to 90% of the technical steps of the entire kill chain. Doing it this way makes sure that the war gets steered in directions that you think are productive and not ones that are damaging to your interests. This isn't World War II. when we were providing the Soviets with artillery and shells and fuel, because they would use them however they felt was appropriate. In this case, if there's a specific tactical target that we don't want the Ukrainians to hit, number one, we wouldn't tell them about it. Number two, we wouldn't provide the strategic guidance, the tactical information that is required for them to target those things. So one of the very, very few scenarios that I can see where nuclear weapons could come into play in the Ukraine war would be if the Ukrainians decide to cross the border into Russia proper, that they just experienced such runaway success they decided to go for the gold. Well, they can't do that without American gear, and the American gear cannot be used in the way that it's being used in Ukraine right now without active American participation. So we do not need to worry about the Ukrainians getting ahead of themselves unless we decide we want to empower them to do so, and I can't imagine that is going to happen. You can apply this model to any place where you've got a numerically superior foe who has some logistical concerns. I can see this working great in Korea or Taiwan. I can see this working with Egypt. Any place where there are foes nearby that can't be handled unless you can provide mid to long range strike capability with precision. And if you can do that, the math changes. The other side of the equation that we're not seeing in Ukraine, but we will see elsewhere, are special operations forces. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, CIA, that sort of thing. Where you take a few small teams, usually numbering fewer than 100 people, and throw them behind enemy lines, or you have them directly interfacing with allies in order to get more bang for the buck. Now, in the global war on terror, our special operation forces operated with local groups like the Kurds or the Hazara in Afghanistan in order to kind of bring in American airstrikes. Basically, you travel with the team for protection and for getting the local lay of the land, identifying targets, and then you call in airstrikes. That'll still continue. But one of the things we're seeing with better artillery and rocket coordination is this can happen at multiple levels. The reason that the Special Operation Forces are not active in Ukraine is because Ukraine has nukes, and if you put American boots on the ground, those nukes might come into play, and that's something we're really trying to avoid. But you could do that versus Syria really easily. Now, the Syrian rebels are not benefiting large scale from American equipment because we don't want to piss off Turkey. But I can see, based on certain circumstances, those alliances shifting. And if you get the Kurds running around with some HIMARS, well, that would be a real problem for Damascus. So these are the two pillars of American strategic policy in the future. Working through third parties, fully leveraging American industrial infrastructure and technical capacity. And on the other side, for a more pointed application, special operation forces doing a lot of disruptions either behind enemy lines or in terms of acting sort of like a guidance counselor for militant groups that are already in the region. This is going to last until such time as the United States has gotten over its gun-shy period. Whenever we have a big military conflict, especially if it doesn't go well, we take a breather, and we have to kind of reintegrate the military with society to the point that we are willing to send tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of troops abroad again. That is not going to happen in the United States, I would guess, before 2040. So this is the future of American intervention for at least the next 18 years. And as we're seeing in Ukraine, it's definitely a model at work.